Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is Dom, and today we're going to be building a box shadow generator using HTML, CSS, and a bit of JavaScript, all right? So this is just a fun little project to build up your skills in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but maybe you also want to actually use this tool to generate your CSS box shadows. Now, real quick, if you aren't aware of what a box shadow is in CSS, it looks something like this. So referring to the MDN documentation, you can give elements such as a div a shadow like this, and you can specify many different things such as the Y and X offset, the blur amounts, the blur spread, as well as the color of the blur. So we're going to be building this right here, and we can see if I was to expand these range sliders, it's going to update the shadow immediately, and also it's going to give me on the bottom here the actual CSS value for the box dash shadow property. So all of these sliders work, and it's actually quite straightforward to build something like this. So going inside this tab right here, let's begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. So going inside the HTML, we can begin by going inside the body here and creating a new div with a class of box, just like this. And inside this box, we can create a new label with some text saying offset X, and also make a new input field right down here, and it's going to be a type of range, and also giving this a class of offset-x. Now, this is going to represent the first slider for the X axis on the box shadow, and we're going to say it's going to have a range from 0, so a min of 0, to a max of 100. Okay, and we're also going to default its value to be 2. So if I was to save this, go back in the browser here, refresh, we get something like this. So we've got this range slider from 0 to 100 with a default of 2. Okay, now of course we're going to be using CSS very shortly to turn this into this right here stylistically. Now going back inside VS Code, let's just duplicate these two lines and create an offset Y, and we can just make the class also offset-y, very straightforward. And the same thing again for the blur radius, saying blur radius just like this, and giving it a class of blur-radius. And two more here, we have also the blur spread, so once again the exact same thing, blur-spread. And then lastly here we have an input with a type of color. So this label is going to be called color, and now the type is going to also be color. Now for this one we're going to give it a default value of black, but I'm also going to remove the min and max as they're no longer relevant to a color. They're only relevant for the range input field. So I'll get rid of this and have a default value of black, just like this. And of course, the class is going to be blur-color, or simply just color, like that. I'll save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and we get this right here. So we have all of the sliders as well as the color input, just like that. And lastly, for the HTML, we're also going to create a new input with a type of text, and it's going to have a class of CSS value. And of course, it's going to be a read-only input field, which holds the generated CSS value. Now, we also are going to have an on-click event on this input field to say this.select. So calling this.select on the input field when the user clicks on it is going to select the entire input field. In other words, it's going to highlight it. So if I was to go back in the browser here and I refresh, I'll just give this input field a value real quick. I'll say, for example, dcode as its value, and refresh. If I click on it, bang, it's going to be highlighted. This way your user can easily copy the value from the box shadow. Okay, cool. Go back inside here and just remove that value of dcode. Okay, let's head up inside the CSS to, of course, add some styles. We can begin with a rule set targeting the box class. and give this a width of 300 pixels, a text align of center, some padding of 16px, and a margin of 32px, and a font family of sans serif. Okay, save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get this right here. Let's hop down once again in the CSS, and this time target the inputs inside the box, and we'll say a margin of 8 pixels top and bottom and 0 for left and right, as well as a display of block, and this is going to ensure that each input field is going to have its own line alongside the labels. And lastly, a width of 100% to ensure the input fields take up the available space. I'll refresh here and we get this. So it's looking pretty good so far. And that is all for the CSS inside these style tags. But of course, we need to now generate some CSS using JavaScript. So heading down to the script tags in the HTML here, we're going to now get a reference to every single HTML element that we created aside from the labels. So we can say const box equal to document.querySelector and pass in here a class of box. Let's duplicate this a few more times, so 6 more times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And to duplicate lines in VS Code, you do Shift, Alt, and then the down arrow. So for these ones, we can say simply X and then a class of offset-X to match the input field right up here. Okay, so this class. And the same goes for the Y, offset-Y. A new constant, or we can call this one radius, and we can target the blur-radius class. We can have spread targeting the blur, let me spell this correctly, spread targeting the blur-spread class, okay? And also a color targeting the color class, and lastly a CSS value targeting the CSS-value class. So now we have all of these input fields and the actual box itself referenced in the JavaScript code. So now we can, of course, do things with these elements. So hopping down here, let's define a new function called updateBoxShadow, and this is going to be the main function within the code here, and it's going to grab the values out of these elements and then place them inside the CSS or the inline styles for the box itself. So we can make a new constant inside here called v, short for value, and this is going to be the CSS value for the box shadow property. So if I go back to the documentation right here, we can see that upon scrolling down, we have this option to provide the offset X, offset Y, blur radius, spread radius, and color to the box shadow property. Okay, so we're going to be using this syntax right here, and we need to simply create this string where it takes in all of those 5 values. So going back inside VS Code here, let's use template strings. So using the backticks near the 1 on your keyboard, we can use these JavaScript template strings. So within this $ and curly brackets, we can simply say x.value and then add px after your closing curly bracket. And if, for example, the user chooses a value of 10 with the slider, it's going to be 10px, just like that. And of course, we need to now do this a few more times for every single other property. So we can add a space here and then copy this and paste it for the y.value. Same thing for the radius dot value, and the same thing for the spread dot value, and then of course lastly the color. Now luckily for the color, you simply just say color dot value, and you don't need to add a hash or a RGBA to signify color. It's going to work automatically. So a color dot value at the end here is going to be perfectly fine. And now we can simply update the text box, the CSS value, and the actual inline styles on the box shadow. So we can say CSS value dot value is equal to v, then finally box dot style dot box shadow is equal to v. And this line right here is going to set that inline style. Now let's go back in the browser, refresh here. I'm going to change a few settings around just like this. Then I'm going to say update box shadow just like this. Call that function, bang, we get the box shadow generated and we get the CSS value at the bottom here. If I was to inspect the box right up here, we have that inline style being set. Okay, perfect. But we now need to say, whenever I change one of these range sliders, I want to call this function so it updates every time. So to achieve that, let's hop back inside here. Underneath the update box shadow function, we can simply reference all of the input fields inside an array and then update the on-click listener, or my mistake, sorry, the on-input listener for each one of those input fields. So we can say here, X, Y, radius, spread, and color. So inside an array, using the square brackets here, I can say dot for each. So for every single one of those input elements, we're going to hop down here and run this function. This function is going to simply say elements dot on input is equal to update box shadow. So call this function whenever each of these, or whenever one of these elements receives input. Okay. I'll go back in the browser, refresh. Nothing happens so far inside the bottom and the shadow, but if I was to change something, we get that box shadow being generated, and I can keep going, and the value is also going to update down here, so it's working fine. Now, the very last step here is to make the box shadow appear on page load. It's very straightforward. We just say update box shadow. I save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get the box shadow being generated automatically when the page loads up. So that is all for this video. I hope you guys learned something. If you did, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.